great to be here in Ottawa because I've never been here before. So it was very exciting. A beautiful city. And I really enjoyed because I got to visit the cathedral just down the street. What a gorgeous place. Honestly, it's the most beautiful church I've been in since I was in Krakow, Poland. So I was very excited about that too. Now, I only have a few minutes today. This is what I'm going to be sharing with you. There's two things. We've learned a lot since I turned the manuscript for Forming Intentional Disciples in 4.5 years ago. And we've been learning all the time, moving all the time. I mean, today, as I'm standing here, there are 5 other events that we're putting on around the world in 2 other countries. So there's a lot going on, and we're listening to Catholics and Catholic leaders and pastors and bishops and just leaders at all levels tell us who are really beginning this journey at the parish level. We are seeing something happen now. In the last 4 or 5 years, I have seen such a change in the conversation. Things I frankly never dreamed I would ever see. Honestly, I'll be really straight with you. You know, I've been a Catholic for over 25 years, and I did not believe that I would ever see a real change. And I'm seeing it now. And I think, what we just heard, we've got bishops who are passionate about evangelization, pastors, diocesan staff, parish staff, leaders at every level, lay apostles doing amazing things out there. Wonderful campus ministries, incredible movements. We are incredibly fortunate to be a generation who is living to see this. And so I just want to share briefly something of what we've learned. I'm going to try and share in 40 minutes something of what we normally take 4 days to go over. But just quickly, for my benefit, it would help me. How many people here have read Forming Intentional Disciples, just so I have some idea, background? Okay, great, thank you. All right, my topic is parish renewal. Why is parish renewal important? Because that's where 98% of human beings have the only access for the Catholic Church. They will not be spending their time in renewal movements, as wonderful as movements are, but they're not accessible to most people. The parish is the church inserted into a neighborhood, accessible on the ground. And so that is really, really so critical. The parish is, in many ways, we've had these fantastic movements, and the parish has been like the slumbering 800-pound gorilla, asleep, and yet without it, we cannot evangelize the world. We cannot bring Christ to the world without the parish and the people in the parish and lay people. That's where most of us have our only access to the church. So the heart of renewal, parish renewal, is hugely important. And the center of that is forming intentional disciples, which is probably not a surprise that I would say something like that. But I'm serious. I do, because of the book and all, my life has changed, the Institute has changed. So I'm doing all kinds of clergy days now and just all sorts of things around the world. And yet, what I keep running into is we keep wanting primarily to focus on institutions. Institutions will not save us. And I know we're the big institution makers. We're the big battalion people, Catholics, right? We are vast networks of schools and hospitals and amazing Catholic institutions. I think there's an annual report, and the last time I looked, did you know there's like 700,000 Catholic institutions, including parishes and all over the world? I mean, it's staggering the number of things that the church does. But those institutions are not our riches. Our riches are found in our people who have been bought with a price, who have been filled with the Holy Spirit, who are the ones that if we call them to that encounter and we help facilitate that journey to discipleship, they will be the ones who bear fruit. If we make disciples, they will take care of our institutions. And they will do things we haven't even dreamed of yet. Because the power of God entering into a receptive heart bears fruit that changes the world. And so we have to start with our people. The heart of parish renewal is forming intentional disciples. It is creating a community where it is frankly easier to become an intentional disciple, to live as an intentional disciple, and to make intentional disciples. Now, we've dealt, as they said, I've listened to the stories of tens of thousands of ordinary Catholics all over the world talk about their lived relationship with God. And it's these stories that helped us understand what was really going on. There's a de facto lived lay Catholic culture at the average parish level it's not our theology. We have a beautiful theology of evangelization. I'm telling you, the gap between our lived reality and our theology is like the size of a Grand Canyon in terms of evangelization. And so I've met people seriously, really great Catholics, committed Catholics, who literally told me, until I read your book, I did not know it was possible to have a lived relationship with God. Or they would say, I thought I was betraying my Catholic faith by being a disciple. Seriously. They thought that they were being unfaithful by being a disciple. How do they get that impression when we have this gorgeous theology? It's because there's a de facto, sort of just lived, usually unspoken culture that for ordinary Catholics at the parish level that has powerfully and we didn't know this was happening. It has suppressed, literally, it suppresses the expression of discipleship in many of our parishes. When that culture starts to be broken, then people start moving. Then evangelization takes off. So it's an amazing, amazing process. Our parishes need to be places where the culture facilitates the journey to discipleship. People saying yes, people responding to the graces they've received in the sacraments, responding to the power of the Holy Spirit. So, and I'm sorry, but the bishop already quoted this passage, and it was very central. I'm going to have to talk. No. But seriously, when I do clergy days, I spend a whole hour just on the relationship of personal faith, sacramental grace, and disposition. But this, again, is it's a little section of the Catechism that's called Liturgy, a Source of Life. But here's the second passage. It says, the sacred liturgy must be preceded by evangelization, faith, and conversion, because then it will produce its fruits in the lives of the faithful. New life in the Spirit, involvement in mission of the church, and service to her unity. What that implies is, if we don't see the fruits, we need to go back and say, has evangelization, faith, and conversion occurred? Because it's, you know what they used to call it, in coal mining territory, they talked about the canary in the coal mine. Basically, if there were poisonous gases in the old days before they had meters and all, they just stuck a poor canary up there. The canary keeled over, you got out. That was your warning signal, your early warning signal. Lack of fruit is our early warning that evangelization is not taking place. There is no such thing, there should be no such thing as fruitless liturgy, fruitless sacraments. The idea that most of us talk about confirmation as graduation, and that's universal, every parish and diocese I've ever worked in uses that language because that's their experience. That's not fruit. That's a canary in the coal mine. And this is my little picture. If you think of let's just look at the liturgy, think of the Eucharist. But we tend to talk about it just sort of by itself in splendid isolation, not reference to anything else. But if we go back to that catechism reference, what's supposed to precede it? Evangelization, faith, conversion, so that we bear much fruit. If my parish is primarily maintenance-oriented and not missionary-oriented, a little buzzer should go off in my head that says, we have a fruit problem here. That if I don't see fruit, then I need to ask what's happening in the evangelization, faith, and conversion department. Because the sacraments, the liturgy is valid. The power of God, the redemptive power of Jesus Christ's offering is being poured out through it and made available to us. The question is, are we open? There's a famous, I don't have the slide here, but there's a famous quote that I've always loved from a Benedictine abbot in England. And he uses the image of a mountain stream, and in Colorado it really means something, okay? So we got all these massive mountains and mountain streams, and there's boulders in the middle of the stream. He says, until I have had that encounter with Christ, the grace of redemption has not been made mine. I am like a boulder in the middle of a mountain stream. Grace is pouring over me, around me, past me, 20, 30, 40 miles an hour, but it doesn't penetrate. I'm the boulder untouched in the middle of the stream. What enables the grace to enter us and to be communicated? It's made available to us, but will it enter us? Will it be communicated to us? That is our response, and that's what we address when we evangelize. So that the grace then begins to bear fruit, and fruit is what the world is waiting for. Fruit fuels evangelization. Frankly, I hate to tell you this, but they don't actually care much about our theology. The vast majority of people in the world don't care what we think we believe. All the nuns that Bishop Christian was talking about, the NONES, not the sisters, of course, they don't care. The little bit they know, they either disagree with us on or they think they just blow it off. They're just not interested. But they are riveted when we bear fruit. Because that is the evidence, the living evidence that God is in our midst. That He is in your life, in my life, in our community. And that they're interested in. In practice, not in our theory, but in practice, we have come at the parish level. And here I'm talking, you have to understand, it's not just my experience, but I'm part of a whole network of lay leaders, ordained leaders, religious leaders who are working in parishes and dioceses all over the world. In practice, in most settings, and there are many exceptions. I've worked in some absolutely remarkable diocesan parishes and also, parishes run by religious communities. So there's fabulous things going on out there. But generally speaking, at the diocesan level, we have accepted religious activity or religious identity, Catholic identity, without personal faith, without intentional discipleship as normal. And one of the implications of that is we have gotten used to relative fruitlessness. And we just accept it as normal at every level of our lives. In our practice, in our priorities, where we spend our money, how we respond to somebody who actually goes through a conversion, which freaks us out. Could you just chill? You're like way too excited here and you're making me nervous. It affects mission to the world. It affects everything. And this absence of fruit is honestly why we're failing at the new evangelization. Because the fruit just of us in this room, the fruit we together are intended to bear, and my fruit belongs to you and your fruit belongs to me, and I need some help here, so please, I need more fruit. Even if I never meet you, if we never have a chance to talk in the communion of saints, there's a communion of fruit bearing. There's a communion of charisms. There's a communion of mission. And my fruitfulness somehow empowers you, even if I never have a chance to know the wonderful things God is calling you to. And so this has enormous ramifications. Disciples bear a lot of fruit. A disciple just starts to change the culture just by being there. They ask different questions, they see different things. Evangelizing parishes that we've worked with, and we've worked with some of them for quite a while, I know this is radical, people come to Mass. I'm not kidding, really. I mean, Mass attendance goes up because disciples want to worship. They want to pray. So adoration. They want to serve. So all of a sudden you've got all these people who say, okay, how can I help? Disciples move into the core. The research says that only about 4% of American Catholic adults do two things. They attend Mass every weekend, and they're actually involved in their parish in some way outside of attending Mass. Only 4%. And I'm guessing everyone in this room belongs to the 4%, or you would not be wasting your time with me, right? But seriously, that's about 3 million people. I wrote Forming Intentional Disciples for the 3 million. Because you and I are the ones who will determine everything. We make all the decisions at every level of the parish's life, and we implement them all too. And we pay for them all. It's a small group that's doing this. But you and I, our decisions will determine what happens next. What God does through us, how He leads us, will determine the future. Disciples give. Evangelizing parishes, they tell me over and over, we have the highest per capita giving in the diocese. Disciples, parishes grow. And this is fascinating. We didn't know this. Why? One of the reasons they grow is because there are millions of American adults who are hungry right now, who are looking for spiritual alternatives. And if they hear your parish, if they hear that, Perpetual Help or St. Cecilia's or whatever is like cool stuff is going on over there and people's lives are changed, they will just show up. We're not used to thinking of people coming to us in that way who weren't even born Catholic. Did you know? This is so fascinating. I'm sorry, as you probably know if you've read the book, yes, I do a lot of statistics, but this was really amazing. The latest Pew study, they asked some amazing questions. They didn't just stop with the boring stuff like, what religion are you? Catholic, Protestant, Buddhist, whatever. Oh, no, they went beyond that. And they discovered that there's millions of Americans who were not raised Catholic, do not have Catholic parents, but still think of themselves as partially Catholic. They're half a Catholic. No. Now, I'm a convert, and actually in my RCA group, one of my fellow sort of catechumens wrote something called the Half a Catholic Blues. And it's like, I'm only half a Catholic and I got the blues. And then it went on, I don't know how to cross myself and genuflect, but I'm only half a Catholic. What can you expect? Okay? We've got half a Catholics out there with no background. Somehow, for some reason, they identify with the church. And we don't even know why. We didn't even know these people existed. 45%, they say, the 45% of all American adults have some connection to the Catholic Church. That's 112 million people. There is no other religious tradition in this country, or in Canada, I don't know about Canada actually, but in the United States, has that kind of reach. And I'm sure the same dynamics are true here. So, fruit-bearing parishes that are filled with disciples bear fruit, and they draw these hungry people who come to us. And the fruit is coming out of this river of living water that Jesus promised us. What do you do? Now, these are just first steps. You've just heard Bishop Christian talk, in great detail about the experience of one parish. We've worked with lots and lots and lots of parishes. The details vary. But what we have found is that parishes in the early days who are seeking to become evangelizing, to become centers of disciple making, basically do these four things. They lay a foundation of intercessory prayer. They break the silence. I'll talk about that. They offer multiple opportunities to encounter Jesus in the midst of the church. And they expect conversion. They think of it as normal, not weird, not super amazing, not like God, out of 1,000 people, God zapped you. But normal. And therefore, they plan for it. Okay, intercessory prayer. I am Catholic today because as a completely clueless undergraduate at the University of Washington with a head full of anti-Catholic mush because I was raised as a fighting fundamentalist in southern Mississippi. Yes, that's serious fundamentalism. I'm sorry, northern fundamentalism doesn't count, really. I'm sorry. Canadian fundamentalism, really. Mississippi is serious. But that was filled my head. I walked through the door across the threshold of a Catholic church in Seattle that I had never entered before, looking for a place to pray. I'd gone through a conversion. I was looking for a place to pray during the day. Catholic churches are open. Protestant churches were closed, but I didn't know why. And I felt the real presence. And that is why you and I are having this conversation today. Now, I am not the only person. It turned out, I learned much later, 50 years previously, another Protestant student from the University of Washington had walked across the threshold, seen the liturgy, fell in love with it, became Catholic, became a Dominican priest, became pastor of the parish who had changed his life, eventually became provincial of the province. And then when I finally arrived, he was the elderly saint in residence at Blessed Sacrament Parish in Seattle, as in his retirement. And we used to call him Father Love. He was a Methodist Free Catholic, he would tell you. And but many people's lives were changed because the spiritual atmosphere of that parish. I knew people whose lives were all over the map. I mean, they were involved in some pretty serious stuff. They were not believing, they were not Catholic, they were nothing, but they would simply come and sit in that sanctuary. And because you could feel the presence of God in that place. That's what happens when we start to take intercessory prayer seriously at a communal level for parishes. There was a diocese I was working with a few years ago, and I don't know, I was there, I can't even remember why I was there, but I was there for about a week. And all week long, this was not scheduled, but people came up to me and said, "Oh, can I talk to you?" I'm like, "Sure." So I'd listen, and then I'd listen some more, and I'd listen some more to all these various people, usually diocesan leaders at various levels. And they all were talking about the same thing, that there was a sense of bond. They didn't use the word bondage, but like obstacles The diocese was really about to experience major breakthrough. Everyone knew it, and yet there were these problems that could not seem to be resolved. And I listened and listened, and finally I said, here's my suggestion. Take a year, gather intercessors together, and quietly have them begin praying for the spiritual renewal of your community. And I remember I was talking to one priest, and he said, okay, let me get it straight. You mean like we're going to meet once and pray? I'm like, no. No, a year. Sustained, organized intercessory prayer. Okay, all right, we'll do it. I came back 6 months later, and one by one, people came up to me and said, remember what you suggested 6 months ago? I said, yeah. They said, we did it. I said, great. They said, all the obstacles are gone. They had simply melted away one at a time. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody had to go out and cut off heads or draw lines in sand or do anything. Just one at a time, they mysteriously resolved. And that diocese, in fact, is having major breakthrough right now. When I teach intercessory prayer, when we do the called and gifted, I always say, if I was a pastor, the first thing I would do is find my intercessors, bring them together in front of the Blessed Sacrament, and have them begin praying on a sustained basis for the spiritual renewal of my community, and the rest will follow. All right. Diocese of Lansing has been doing this as a diocese, because they're in the middle of 3 synod process on evangelization. They're from the bishop on down, they're totally committed to this. It's very exciting. But they spent a whole year in prayer, and they saw things already happening before they did anything else. Mass attendance was going up, communities were more welcoming, people got involved in more outreach, because already the spiritual climate was changing. The second thing is we've got to break the silence. And I think this is pretty obvious. You've probably been hearing this at all the speakers. But we have discovered over the years that there was a de facto culture of silence, especially for lay Catholics, that said, we just don't talk about where you are in your lived relationship with God. That's the deal. I will never talk about mine, and you will never have to talk about yours, and we'll just pretend that that's all taken care of. Everything's just fine there. And now we're going to get busy doing things, right, at the parish level. I've had people in full-time ministry at very high levels come up to me and say, until I read your book, I did not know it was possible to have a relationship with God. Good, faithful Catholics. These are not hypocrites. They are highly committed, faithful Catholics in full-time ministry from highly committed, faithful Catholic families. I said, what do you think happened? They said, we just never talked about it. I did not know. A friend of mine says, he says it's like Jesus is he who must not be named. We kind of de facto, we treat him like he's Voldemort in a Harry Potter film. Because somehow that wasn't Catholic. Only Protestants did that. And if I did that, they would be sure and let me know that I was showing my Protestant roots. Okay. So we want to tell our own stories. There's a lot of ways to break the silence, this de facto powerful silence that makes people feel just incredibly intimidated. We want to tell our own story of God's, impact in our life, role in our lives. We want to listen to their stories. One of the things we spend a lot of time teaching people and making disciples is how to have what we call threshold conversations. That is, listen to somebody else's journey with God. Invite them to tell you their story and really listen and understand the implications of what they have seen. So where have they been? Where are they now? And therefore, where God might want to meet them. And that is one of the most amazing things I've ever come across. It's one of the single most powerful evangelizing tools is listening evangelism. Because nobody ever asks. And nobody ever listens. We were doing this in a diocese, and we had 180 Catholics there, leaders going through. And we had 30 volunteers, and they all came from the evangelical world because that's the only ones they could find who'd come in. So the pastors came in armed for bear. They had their Bibles, right, and all their notes, and they had their texts. I mean, it was, you could tell. I took one look at them and said, okay, I know what's going on. They are here to evangelize the pagans. Because that's how I understood it too. So I said, fine. I said, everybody calm down. It's all right. Your job is to keep them on task, because their task is not to read a speech. You want them to tell you the real living story of their lived relationship with God. So you just keep bringing them back. And you know what was so amazing at the end? Basically, there was 180 of us in this hall, and the 30 witnesses walked in, and one man started applauding spontaneously, and then everybody started applauding as they came in all the time. And then these pastors, these evangelical pastors, stood up and said, you know what? They were so moved by this experience. They said, I can't even tell my own story in my own congregation because nobody will listen. And one woman who was clearly like a Pentecostal, she was a black Pentecostal pastor, I think, and she was up there prophesying over us, and, the Spirit of the Lord is here, and all the amazing, but they were so moved because someone really listened. And that is, we tell our story, we hear other people's story, and we tell Jesus' story. The vast majority of Catholics, we have slowly discovered, have never heard Jesus' story, the great story as Father Robert Barron calls it, clearly as a story, and they've never had a chance to process it and respond to it. And that is the gospel message. That is the power. There's a power in telling Jesus' story that changes lives. And most of the time, we've heard bits and pieces. We hear about Bethlehem at Christmas time, and then there's this thing that happens at Easter. Did you know Barna Research asked American Christians what they knew about Easter? 68% of Catholics are at Mass on Easter weekend. But only 37% of them knew it was about the resurrection. And what do we do? Think about, what do you do on Easter Mass? What do we do at the vigil on Sunday? We read the story of the resurrection. In fact, we take parts. Half the people present didn't know it was about the resurrection. People we know now, most people need to hear the story many times, not once. At least 7 to 11 times. We need overkill here. We're often in practice, we want to find the retreat, the book, the silver bullet that's going to magically solve everything. A, there's no silver bullet, and B, don't worry. Just every way you possibly can. Preach it. It's in catechesis, it's in RCIA. Tell your stories. Create opportunities for people to tell their stories every time you get together. Put on evangelizing retreats. Overkill. Because it takes a long time for typical people in our generation to process that. It's a journey, okay? So they need to hear it over and over and have space to say, well, do I believe that? And actually, if I do believe it, I don't know if I like that. I don't know. The idea that someone could have a relationship with God is not necessarily good news for a lot of people. It's a whole new idea, but then do I actually want this? What would happen if, God, forbid, should, enter my life? So you break the silence, and one of the ways to do that is to offer multiple opportunities to encounter Jesus in the midst of his church. And you're familiar with some of this, Alpha and Christ's Life and Christ Renews His Parish, etc., RCA, of course. But you notice I've got a lot of them here. That's because there's a lot of really powerful evangelizing, well-tested, field-tested retreats out there that change a lot of people's lives. But you need more than one, because we want overkill. We want saturation. We want reinforcement from 1,000 different angles. So we want CCO and alpha and relit and fill in the blank. Offered at different times because different people will be drawn in through different reasons. Now, this happens to be a parish in Idaho we've worked with for a long time, but they have multiple reinforcing discipleship entry points. They have a 3-day retreat called the Evangelization Retreat. They've offered for nearly 19 years now. They stumbled across it. Another parish told them about it. They brought it in. They had no idea. Within a year, people were having massive conversions, so they drove across the mountains in a snowstorm to come see us. We were less than a year old. But that's how we met them. Because then they said, well, what do we do now? They're all like, But not everybody's going to go to those intense retreats. So some people, there's these little mini retreats. They're Friday night, Saturday. It's a different, for people who, the big retreat's too intimidating. And for some people, called and gifted is the entry point. Everybody loves called and gifted for some reason. I mean, it's fascinating because the whole topic is just fascinating to people. So we get everybody from 18 to 80. And every spiritual level too. People who are spiritually completely prenatal, if you know what I mean. And great saints. I mean, I've met everybody, okay? But everything about it presumes a living God who enters your life, and discipleship. And so it's intriguing. But what's important here in Boise is that they see them all connected, and they see them connected to RCIA. So in RCIA, all their people in Inquiry go through the evangelization retreat as part of Inquiry. But 1/4 of the population in their retreats have been non-Catholics. Baptist pastors, all these Protestants are coming to the retreat. So a lot of them end up in RCIA. So the main thing I'm trying to say is no silos. You see this all one thing connected to another. It's not that, my group's into the retreat and your group, you're doing adoration and you're into discernment and you're into... No, this is a pathway that we have created that we offer over and over again in the parish for different people. When the Holy Spirit touches their lives and they move into that openness, we are ready to help them move. One of the things about this parish, this is really interesting. Nationally, based on our research and all the things we've talked to people about, they say about 5% of practicing Catholics are intentional disciples. That's a very rough estimate. It may be changing now. That was a couple of years ago. And about 8% are involved in ministry. But in this parish, it's 5 times the national average in both areas, and that's not an accident. Intentional disciple is someone who is deliberately seeking to follow Jesus as his disciple in the midst of his church, someone who is consciously doing that. So it goes beyond being a cultural Catholic or just, I'm a Catholic because I'm Italian or Hispanic or Filipino or whatever, or I was just raised Catholic. So it's entering into that. Their mass attendance, of course, went up. Their giving went up. Yes, they have the highest per capita giving in the diocese. And they have enormous numbers of ministries that emerged that dealt with the community. Drug addiction, homelessness, all sorts of stuff. They had an enormous impact on their part of the city. So there's been enormous fruit over the years, but they started with calling people to that encounter. Now, this parish has an amazing story too. They have, the number of disciples there has grown about 500% in the last 7 years. The key leader there, the keeper of the flame, happens to be a lay person, a lay staff member, a young man, because there's been a lot of pastoral turnover. So you have to have continuous, vision, and he's been the keeper of the flame. Fascinating stuff is going on there. They offered Discovering Christ. The very first time they did it, basically they had 230 people show up. And they had told the whole neighborhood, they spread the word, if you want to talk about faith, real stuff, and you want to ask your real questions, you just show up and nothing's off limits. So they had 230 angry, frustrated, disbelieving agnostics and former Lutherans and former Catholics and, it's the whole LA scene. And they wanted to talk. They weren't polite. And the poor Catholic facilitators were a little overwhelmed. So the first one was kind of chaotic, okay? But you know what? My friend who was running it, he said, you know what happened? We had a woman who was a pillar of the community, who was involved in everything. And she felt safe enough in that environment to admit that she did not believe Jesus Christ was the Son of God. So she's now on her own journey. The chaos created safety for her. Marriages were healed, all kinds of stuff went on. What is now happening there is those disciples, those 500 disciples, are moving into the backbone of the parish. They're becoming the core. At every gathering, somebody tells their story. They're breaking the silence. They're creating spaces for people to tell the story of their encounter, their change. They've seen amazing ministries arise because that's what happened. New disciples, their charism starts showing. God basically leads them, and they start these amazing initiatives. And they've had all these people go through the called and gifted discernment process. And as is typical when that happens, vocations start emerging. And so one of the women has now taken first vows as a sister in a local community, and it came out of the discernment process. This is very typical. A couple of little practical things. What we're learning is that the average person, the average Catholic, is starting to trust. These are the thresholds I go over in the book. I have 4 chapters on them, but sort of the journey that typical people make toward discipleship. Most of our people, practicing people, are at the earliest and most passive level, which is trust. If they go through a single evangelizing experience, typically they don't come out as disciples because they have too many other things to deal with. They come out somewhere between curiosity and openness. And I tell you that because there's some ramifications. We've typically, when we do evangelizing retreats, we tend to think of, we'll put them through a retreat, they'll get excited, and then we'll put them to work. Right? Does that sound familiar? You have to understand, a lot of those people are coming out feeling like they're hanging in midair. They look to the rest of us and they say, what just happened? That was like, oh man, that was, what do I do now? And if you're a normal cradle Catholic, first of all, you kind of, inch your way away from them because they're way too intense. And you're like, I don't know, why don't you go talk to Father or something, Oh. Okay. Why? Because they're already beyond the spiritual norm of their community and most of their friends. Part of planning is we have to be ready for these people to come out. They're not yet disciples, but they've moved significantly, and we have to be willing to walk with them the rest of the way, or sometimes they leave us. They leave us not because their faith is dying, but because it's growing, and they can't see any way to be helped in our parishes, and they go to the Protestant world. Or they go into hiding. They backtrack to fit in. So we don't want to do that. One last little thing I'm going to tell you. This is one of my favorite stories from last year. A great privilege. I visited this parish, tiny parish of 400 in a tiny town of 800 in the middle of North Dakota, in a county of 2,500. Okay, so we're in the middle of nowhere. And the pastor had a young pastor who was sent in. The school had been closed. Everybody in town is German Catholic, German Russian. Everybody's Catholic and everybody's related, and they're all involved in agriculture. So half of them are practicing, half are not practicing. He comes in. He has a slightly larger than normal rectory. He takes part of it and remodels it, makes the world's smallest retreat center. And he started offering retreats for 2 or 3 people at a time. He taught them how to pray. They had massive conversions. And by the time I got there a year and a half later, it was him and his 15 apostles around the table. It was like being with Jesus and the first apostles. I mean, it was like so amazing. I thought, oh, man, this is the real thing. And there was like the farming matriarch whose children, spouses, grandchildren, and related, in-laws make up half the town, right? She was there. There was the young guy who'd gone off to college, been part of Focus, came back to farm, but he brought that awareness and those skills with him. There was the woman who starts all the small businesses in town. I mean, every single one of these was absolutely grassroots locals. Completely ordinary cradle Catholics who'd had massive, and by the time I got there, they were not only planning to evangelize their parish and their town, but their entire county and beyond. It's not about money. It's not about numbers. You don't have to be urban. It's an attitude. You've encountered Christ, and now he is sending you. And if you can do it in North Dakota, you can do it anywhere. Big cities, suburbs, small towns, any parish can become a center of renewal, a center of discipleship if we are committed, if we set out to make it easier to become an intentional disciple, to live as an intentional disciple, and to make intentional disciples.